Proverbs 13:20 says, "He who walks with the wise will become wise." I'm Dan Chappa, and Turton Fan and I have been friends for many years, and we've learned a lot from each other, including how to debate opposing views while loving the person. We share a foundation in the essentials of the Christian faith and a love of God and His Word. Here we'll dive deep into the Bible and present both Calvinism and Arminianism and the precise points of disconcurrence. Hopefully the contrast will bring you clarity. Welcome to Disconcurring Theo Amigos. Hey Turton Fan, how's it going?
It's going great. How are you?
Doing real good. Doing real good. So I learned a lesson. I don't know if you can see this, but right under my eye, I have a little cut. Yeah, it's probably real small on the screen. I could blow it up. But anyways, so what I learned is you cannot microwave cream cheese, and I never knew that before, but apparently it's explosive. So literally, like
Inside the foil, or
no, without the foil, but just like a chunk of cream cheese. So I was gonna make it like a spread, like a dip, and so I was microwaving it, and I heard it like cracking after like 20 seconds in the microwave, and then so like I opened the microwave up, and it shot at me, I swear, and so like a piece of cream cheese just hit me right under the eye and just like burned me, and so now
ouch.
now I have a burn right under my so sorry about that, but anyways, but other than that, yeah, things have been good. How have you been?
I've been okay. I can't complain. Let's say that.
All
Can't
right.
complain. I had a friend once who would always answer that question infinitely better than I deserve, which is very true. But if you always answer the same way, the force of the point is eventually lost, I think. But it's very true. He's a good friend.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, so just a little continuity from last time. So we talked about the predestination passages in the book of Acts, and part of my explanation involved at least one of the options was that God has middle knowledge, and He uses that middle knowledge to control situations and that sort of thing. And so out of that, we talked about, well, maybe it makes sense to do an episode on middle knowledge. Now, for history, Turn Fan, you and I have been like discussing middle knowledge for long time, and it's a tough subject. And so I wanted to start with, some of the passages that made me scratch my head and think middle knowledge is true. So just from my personal background on it, I used to participate in debate forums called Crosswalk forums or Christianity.com forums, and there was a guy by the name of Theo Junkie, and so I was talking to him about Romans 8, 29. For whom He did foreknow, He also predestined. And Theo Junkie asked me the question of, well, how does this work in an Arminian view? Isn't God just rubber stamping predestination or His foreknowledge with predestination, right? Predestination doesn't seem to be coming up with anything or affecting anything. It's just a rubber stamp of what He's already foreknown. And I thought about that long and hard, and I was just like, well, what if God foreknows that if a person's in this circumstance, they'll be saved, but if he's in that circumstance, he won't? Or like, let's say the apostle Peter in this circumstance would do X, but the apostle Paul in that circumstance would do Y. And so he just arranges the circumstances. And that was my answer back to him in terms of, well, that's, probably a way to understand it so that God's foreknowledge and predestination don't end up overlapping. I mean, obviously they are connected with each other, but they're not the same thing. And I didn't know at the time that was called middle knowledge and something called Molinism. But it is, and so I guess that was my beginnings with middle knowledge. Now, since then, I've read a lot of books. Philosophers like William Lane Craig, Molina himself, Irenaeus also was certainly held to middle knowledge. So just to give a brief thumbnail sketch on what I take middle knowledge to be. It's God's providence in His way of arranging and controlling things. And I'll say this, that it is not a fundamental commitment. There are things that are more important to me than holding to middle knowledge, right? Obviously, big things like, the divinity of the Son of God and stuff like that, the inerrancy of scriptures. But even within the context of Calvinism and Arminianism, It's more important to me that God has providential control and that man has free will and are responsible. Those are more base level concerns that I have. So I almost don't like the idea that we're starting out with a discussion of monism, and I understand why, because it kept coming up. But at the same time, I'd almost prefer to deal with more important topics first, because without establishing those 2 points, it really doesn't make sense. But you have to hold fast to God has providential control over everything, and men are free and responsible, and those sort of things. Now, from there, there's actually another point which is more fundamental than middle knowledge, which is God knows the future, right? God has perfect foreknowledge of the future. He's never wrong. That's why all the biblical prophecies are the way they are. So I'm definitely not an open theist in that score. And so once you have those 3 things as a foundation, then you can kind of start getting towards middle knowledge. And what it comes down to is this idea that God not only knows what can happen, what's possible, and what will happen, what's in the future, but in between those two, there's this middle ground of he knows what would happen if such and such was the circumstances. And so I'd like to look at a couple passages that talk about that. And there's specific texts where it seems like God knows what people would choose if circumstances were different than they actually are. So with that said, I came up with a verse list, and I sent those to you also. And we can just go one by one through them. We can scan through all of them and talk about what's similar or different about each one, or just make comments. So why don't we start with the Exodus 3, and then we can talk about that one, and then we can move through a bunch of these passages. Does that sound good?
I'm fine with going through the verses that you sent me, although I don't have that list directly in front of me, but we can go through. Obviously, it's fine if just you have the list. The one thing I would say is I don't agree with the definition that you provided for middle knowledge,
Okay.
but I'm happy to. I don't know if that will just come up naturally throughout the discussion, or if you'd prefer to have that discussion up front.
Sure. So it wasn't too technical. Go ahead. What would you, how would you put it?
So the way that God's knowledge, well, first of all, God's knowledge is simple and undivided. In fact, it's just God knows everything, and it's all one and simple. However, from an analytical standpoint, we divide it up, and the way that we, meaning the Reformed churches and almost everyone that discussed this before Molina or one of the other people that were contemporary with him, is that God's knowledge is divided into his natural knowledge, meaning that the things that God knows connected with his own permanent, unchangeable nature, and the free knowledge of God, which are the things that he knows because of he chooses those things to be the way that they are. So there's everything could be boiled down into one of those 2 categories. What Molina or perhaps some others have come up with is this idea that there's a third category of knowledge that's in the middle of those 2. That's middle knowledge, and that this knowledge is specifically knowledge of hypothetical. It's a knowledge of hypothetical situations, or it's a knowledge of what would be under some contingency, and specifically under the contingency. Well, it's what would happen under the contingency that some circumstances were presented. So it's there's a number of issues with it, but in general, that's what it is. It's this idea that there's a third category in the middle between God's free knowledge and his natural knowledge.
So okay, so that's interesting. So let's discuss that a little bit. Let's start with natural knowledge, just to make sure that we're tracking. The way I said it was, God knows what can happen. I that is broad, and it can be organized into subcategories, and I just want to make sure that we're still tracking. I don't disagree with you when you say that it arises or flows out of God's nature, or who God is, essentially his essence. But it also includes the things that he can enable us to do, right? So it's not just things that God can do, but it's things that God can enable us to do, right? So he can make creatures that can walk or chew gum, or some creatures are good enough, not me, but some creatures are good enough to do both, right? Like, so God has that um, capability of creating creatures with abilities, and all of those are comprehended under God's natural knowledge. So, do we track there?
So maybe I should clarify something. And what I'm saying is that there's a certain aspect of God's knowledge which is not depending on God's choice in any way. These are just things God knows of himself uh, prior to consideration of his own choices. And that could encompass things like that he could create a creature with these characteristics and which would do this and that. It could encompass all of those things, but but he knows it uh, antecedent to logically antecedent to that choice that he makes. And then there's the free knowledge, which is how God knows the future, because he chooses which future to of the things if we're applying it to God's providence specifically. There's other areas of God's knowledge besides providence, obviously, but if we're applying it to providence, the anything that God could have, any history God could have made, he knew ahead of time, but the future that he decided will be is the is a result of his choice. And so that falls into the category of free knowledge, since it's contingent on God's choice, as distinct from the knowledge that he has that's not contingent on his own choice.
Yeah. So, right. So, but I guess I come back to, okay. So for starters, if your main concern is, we have to insert this language of God's choice or His plan or His decree, that's not a problem. I mean, I 100% agree with you that that's why what will happen in that sense. It's involved. Now we could quibble about what exactly that choice is, which I think it's specifically just to create and knowing what's going to play out. Um, but that's true that there's a decision to create that's logically prior to God's free knowledge. Um, but I guess I still just coming back to natural knowledge itself. Um, the things that are comprehended under God's natural knowledge will include not just what's possible for God himself to do, but what all the possibilities that he's able to enable anyone else to do. Um, Even if, let's take something a little less controversial, like let's say a piece of glass, right? Like the glass can break, right? You know, God knows that out of his natural knowledge.
So God knows that, or God is the one who decides what creation is, right? So God decides whether we have one sun or whether we look like Tatooine, if that's assuming that's a possible thing. But God also knows that whether it's possible for him to create something like Tatooine, I guess Tatooine is this fictional planet that revolves around two stars or orbits around two stars. If I understood the Star Wars universe well enough. But anyway, so uh, God knows in his natural knowledge that he could create such a universe where there's an inhabited planet that orbits two suns, and God also knows things that are we could say are sort of partially contingent on his will. So if he decides that the laws of physics are thus and such, then he knows that under if he decides that the laws of physics are thus and such, then when a piece of glass falls, it will break. But of course, God could also knows that he could change the laws of physics so that glass is unbreakable, or that glass is as hard as diamonds, or whatever he wants. The laws of physics don't govern God. God governs the laws of physics. So God's knowledge about physics depends on his decree to create.
Okay, so I think that's a great point. And so sometimes we think of uh, natural knowledge in terms of possible worlds or that sort of thing, and I think that language can be helpful, but sometimes it's not. And I think that the reason you just hit the nail on the head, why that language can be um, unhelpful sometimes, if thinking of it in terms of a whole timeline or a whole world or something like that. And the reason is that within that world there are true relations to from this to that, and God's decision on what the laws of physics will be precede, logically speaking, another component in the same timeline or in the same world, which is the glass is breakable, right? So first God decides the laws of physics, and then the glass is breakable and known to be breakable if struck by a rock or whatever, you know. So um, within God's natural knowledge, there's still intricate relationships of this part of a timeline to that part of a timeline, all possible, and they might not be the actual timeline. They may not be this world, you know, like it might involve God's creation of, I don't know, Santa Claus or whatever, Tatooine. It's just even within those possible worlds or possible timelines, there's intricate interrelations between what God might do first and what God might do second. So, in a secondary relation, there is the creatures that God could make in those possible worlds and what they could do, right? Yeah. Okay. So we're tracking. All right. Man. So we've gotten pretty far afield. So I tried to just, you know, just say God knows what can happen, right? And I understand that that's uh, I took a big shortcut in doing that, but I think it's all comprehended under God knows what can happen. So that's kind of my preferred way to just express it, because it's so broad, but it's so it also nutshellizes it.
Okay. Well, I think we may
Yeah.
see it crop up again, but I guess if you're good with that clarification from us, then let's
Yeah.
jump into the first.
Okay. The first verse. Okay. So this is Exodus 3:19, and it says, you know, but I know that the king of Egypt, so Pharaoh, this is God speaking, I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. And so what we have is um, various scenarios under which um, Pharaoh won't let the Israelites go. But God knows those other scenarios, even though they don't exist. And he knows that under those scenarios, um, Pharaoh won't let them go. And so what God needs to do is compel Pharaoh with a mighty hand, which ultimately ends up being the plagues, the famous plagues that hit Israel, and eventually, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh lets the people go. So obviously, there's a lot of other topics involved, including the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. But one thing that I think is important is this passage in terms of, well, God knew, let's say, I don't know. Let's say that the Israelites gathered up all their money and offered it to Pharaoh, and no, that's not going to be enough. He's not going to let him go unless he's compelled by a mighty hand. But there's you know, all these different scenarios that are comprehended in a broad statement like this. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I would point out that the I don't know if there's a reason for selecting the English Standard Version, which follows the Septuagint and Vulgate, as the footnote indicates, as opposed to the Hebrew, which it has, will not let you go, no, not by a mighty hand. Uh, I don't know if there's a reason, but I think that the underlying point is not necessarily invalid, which is that God knows that the king of Egypt will not let the people go, uh, and, and in another sense, he also knows that what would be necessary to make it happen. So, what I think the issue is whether this knowledge that God has is part of God's free knowledge. In other words, is it this way because this is the way God has decided it will be, or does the basis for this knowledge come from somewhere else? That would be this distinction between this being free knowledge versus this being middle knowledge.
Yeah.
So
So I think that's an excellent point. But um, what does God do that makes it this to be the case, that makes this true in your view?
how does God make this true?
Right.
Well, the God makes it true by making Pharaoh, right? He made him a certain way, and he brought about various situations in Pharaoh's life. And we're not given the whole story of Pharaoh, but this is a Pharaoh that grew up not knowing Moses. This is a Pharaoh that grew up ruling over the Israelites, seeing them as slaves his whole life. This is a Pharaoh who is, as far as we can tell, based on the other evidence in Egyptology that we have, that everyone treated him like a god. Uh, this is so it's somebody full of arrogance that's been his pattern of life, and it's been what was inculcated in him since birth, uh, and
What
it
I'm sorry.
was God's whole plan in raising him up was for this situation.
So okay, but let me see if I can ask it a different way. So there's something about Pharaoh that makes it true that if he's offered money rather than the plagues, he won't let them go. Is that what you're saying?
Uh, yeah, there's something about there. Yes, this is a statement about the stubbornness. Let's say let's just call it, for lack of a better term, the stubbornness of the Pharaoh.
Okay, but the stubbornness is manifested in this kind of counterfactual property that if he is offered money, he won't release the Israelites.
Well, I mean, in fact, there's nothing here about. I don't think there's anything here about money, but the what was mentioned here is a mighty hand. But I think that the point of the expression about he won't let you go, not no, not by a mighty hand. I think the point of that expression is that he's stubborn, and we nothing's going to make break his resolve. It's that's the idea. Whether it's literally money or literally threatening the life of his kids or what it is, but it's the point is he's a stubborn person and he will not obey what the command that he's given.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge here is I don't think I think vocab even just starts to run short because like let's say we could say well God predetermined that that Pharaoh wouldn't let the people go under other circumstances. Right, but the problem is it never happens. Those other circumstances don't ever take place.
Yeah, and they're not mentioned. The other circumstances aren't mentioned here, unless you're going to say by a mighty hand is the other circumstance. But you might even say that it is talking about that. So in other words, if you read verse 20, so after it says no, not by mighty hand in verse 19, it says, and I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, and after that he will let you go. So at first it's like it's not going to happen, not by a mighty hand, and then I'm going to smite him. So maybe it means like no natural force, no merely human power could get the king of Egypt to do this. In which case, then he would be talking about this other, hypothetical. But what the question would be is what I think the question that you're asking is what would make that true, that no human force could get the king of Egypt to do that what God's commanding. But there is an answer to that, which is that the king of Egypt is extremely stubborn and arrogant and all of these things. And if you and then you say, well, why is he that way? Well, God arranged it to be that way, but whether God arranged it to be that way isn't really the point of the passage in mentioning it here. Elsewhere, it is that he raised up the Pharaoh for this purpose. But I don't know if that's. I'm not sure if I'm
So
answering a different question than you're asking, or
so
yeah.
okay, so maybe part of the issue is the word unless. It seems like that is a translation difference. Um, it looks like it's there though. There's so many translations that have the word unless. Um, but you don't think that's original or authentic, is that right?
Well, if you just go back to the ESV footnotes, you see that it acknowledges that that's the Septuagint and Vulgate, but it's not the Hebrew. And you could probably look it up in the Blue Letter Bible that for that. They should have the Hebrew, and you should be able to track it that way.
No?
Although honestly, my Hebrew is not amazing.
Oh, I only took one semester of it, and that was that was good. Yeah, it's harder. Well, I found it to be harder. No, not low. So interesting. Low can mean without. Um, without a mighty hand, otherwise than a mighty hand. Either of those would have the same sense. Um, I don't know. I'm hesitant to just throw out the word unless because it's in so many of these different translations. Um, and at least just based on a scan, it seems like without would be fine as a translation. Um,
I don't think. I mean, my argument doesn't hinge on it being with being a legitimate way of expressing it in English. I'm okay with the Septuagint's translation and the Vulgate's translation on that, at least on this point. I mean, I think the point is, uh, even if you say no, not by a mighty hand, that statement isn't to be understood absolutely because of the next verse, which is, but I'll cast, and I'm going to do signs and wonders on Egypt, and then he's going to let you go. Then he will let you go. So it's not even if 19 is understood without the word unless in the translation, it isn't an absolute statement. There's still kind of an implied unless I work these signs and wonders, which I'm about to work in verse 20. So, I mean,
but
I'm
how
not
can
worried about the word unless per se. Yeah.
how can it not be denying that Pharaoh would let them go in various other circumstances then?
I mean, it's not talking about this. I mean, the point, of course, isn't about those other specific circumstances, but
Yes,
yeah,
it is.
it is a denial that it's a. The point, of course, is that what it's going to take to get you out of here is a supernatural, God's supernatural act is what's going to take to get you out of here. So
Okay.
that's the point. But I don't mind saying that sort of implied in there is bribing the king, asking him nicely. These things aren't going to work. If you
Okay.
tried them, they're not going to work. Or
Right.
yeah,
Okay. And that's okay. So now that no that's my question. Thank you. So what is it that makes it true? And I think you said okay, but it's because Pharaoh's stubborn. But
mm-hmm.
Pharaoh's stubbornness means that if he's asked politely, he
Mm-hmm.
won't let them go.
Sure.
Right.
And
Now,
uh-huh.
that is not what we would typically say something that God has predetermined. And the reason why is because God, if predetermined is theistic predeterminism is true, it's that God has predetermined the future. But those are not future events. They're not past events. They're something else.
Okay, yeah,
So
that's fine.
so that's where I'm coming to the point where there seems to be almost an intrinsic problem with the vocab in just articulating what exactly happened here. It
Well, that's why I thought it was very critical to get to that question of free versus natural knowledge,
okay,
and that middle being something in the middle. Because let's take aside that it's the king of Egypt that will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand, and let's say that instead we said that the mountain will not will not allow you to pass unless compelled by a mighty hand. And then, but then the next verse says, but I'm going to blast open the mountain and divide the mountain asunder, and you can walk through, something like that. And you could even you could make a similar comment. God didn't, but he could have made a similar comment about the Red Sea. You're not going to be able to get your people through the Red Sea unless I do some miracle. And all trying to swim across with all these women and children, it's not going to work. People will die. But unless I do something special, you're not going to get across. And he could say that, and what would ground the truth of that is not that God had this hypothetical future where the people tried to swim across the Red Sea, not that it actually existed, this alternate universe didn't actually exist, but the nature of the things that God created. So the fact of people being unable to walk on water, women and children having more trouble to swim than adult men, and so on and so forth. Obviously, that's just a really big generalization. There's plenty of people who can't swim and so on and so forth. But the point is, this could have been a statement made about a contingency that has only natural things. In fact, you mentioned one earlier where you talked about a bottle breaking, right? So if the idea is if you hit this bottle with a hammer, it will break. That God could say that about a bottle without needing to have a predestinated a hypothetical future where the bottle gets hit, because God could be talking about the frangibility of the bottle and explaining that a bottle, the laws of physics operate on a bottle in this way. So this type of statement is fully consistent with God's free knowledge if, in fact, human choices are within the realm of God's control. In other words, if God's
Wait,
sovereign over those things.
I'm sorry. I thought you just switched things. Are you saying that this is talking about natural knowledge or free knowledge, on your view?
So all of these have to be free knowledge because they
Was
are contingent on God's decree to create.
so, but the bottle was an example of natural knowledge, not free knowledge.
No, no, no. The bottle is also an example of free knowledge because it's contingent on God's decree to create.
All natural knowledge of anything extrinsic to God is contingent on a hypothetical degree to create.
Well, anything that's contingent on his decree to create isn't natural knowledge. It's free knowledge.
No, no, no. Okay, so yeah, so that's exactly why I asked the question I did about natural knowledge, right? So within that natural knowledge or possible world timeline, right, there is a logical relationship, and it depends on if God creates this mountain, then the mountain isn't passable. If God creates the glass, then the glass can break. If God creates a person, the person can choose X or Y, right? Those things are all part of natural knowledge, not free knowledge.
Yeah. Well, we fundamentally disagree about that, I guess.
So yeah, so we got to suss that out because let's see. So you're saying, let's take the bottle one more time. So the bottle's breakability. Let's say there's a possible world in which the bottle is struck by a rock and breaks. In that possible world, earlier, God creates the world and he sets the laws of physics such that the glass is can be fractured, right? Those are all possible things that God can do and make, right? So I don't see any aspect of free knowledge involved with that glass yet. Do you?
So, well, we're just there's a distinction here to be made. One is a distinction between God able to create a breakable bottle versus an unbreakable bottle, a plastic bottle, or versus a glass bottle, whatever it might be. But is God able to do those things? God knows whether he is able to do those things through his natural knowledge.
Right.
But the question of if this bottle is hit by a hammer, will it break? Is contingent on God's create how God has decided to create things. If God decided to create glass one way, the answer will be one thing. If he decided to create glass a different way, it would be a different thing.
So is that choice possible? God
Is
can
what choice possible?
God can create the laws of physics the way he did or some other way.
Uh, well, as far as we know, and the scriptures don't say a lot about how God could have changed the laws of physics, but considering that God works miracles that violate the laws of physics, it seems safe to say that God could have chosen different laws of physics than the ones that he chose.
Right. So since that alternative was possible, is that part of God's natural knowledge?
Is what part of God's natural knowledge?
That physics can be this way or that way.
Assuming that I'm right, assuming that indeed physics can be in multiple ways, God knows that fact, that physics could be different if God chose it to be different. He knows that through his natural knowledge.
Right.
But
So that's part of
this,
his natural knowledge. Now, let's take one of those branches that physics is going to be the way it actually turned out to be, right? So, assuming that as part of his natural knowledge, does he not know that given physics is the normal way, and given the properties of the glass and given the properties of the rock, the rock would break the glass if it strikes it.
so once we're getting into so we're starting from the foundation of these are things God could do, what God could do, and what would be the result of that is we're possibly talking about two different things and conflating them, right? So one of the in the case of the if God's considering before deciding to create, but he's considering if he decided to create, and he decided that the laws of physics would be this way, and he decided this and this and this and this. We're still talking about God, what God has decided, and God also has the option at any point along that way to suspend the laws of physics. We know this much because he has suspended the laws of physics before. So it's not even a given to God whether or not the bottle will break based on the laws of physics, since God still has an opportunity to suspend the laws of physics. But he knows that if he has the glass hit the hammer, and if he doesn't suspend the laws of physics that he's planning to create in this plan, he knows what the result will be, right? And he knows all of these possibilities through his natural knowledge. However, if we're talking about a concrete person, and we're talking about what would happen with that concrete person, we are now smuggling in the fact that God has decreed to create that person and that has decreed the circumstances in which they are and all of these other things.
Yeah. So if we're talking about an actual created person existing in the real world, yeah, right. Of course, of course. But if we're talking about the possibility of like when God is planning it out before he's created anything, he's planning this out, and he thinks of the possibility of Pharaoh, that sort of thing. So that's what I'm ultimately asking is, this when he was before the foundation of the world, when he's creating Pharaoh, is he considering Pharaoh's unwillingness to answer or respond positively to the nice offer, to the polite offer? Is that part of his natural knowledge, or is it part of his free knowledge? In terms of, is it something that just God, um, yeah. So is that part of his natural knowledge or free knowledge?
So anything logically prior to God's decree to create will be under his and not contingent on it, therefore would be under his natural knowledge. Anything that's contingent on it would be under his free knowledge.
So, but let's analyze when we talk about decree. Do you mean God's actual no kidding decree of this is the world I want to create and everything go, and then Fiat there, here comes light, or are you talking about God's consideration of his own power? I can create the world this way, or I can create the world that way. Before he's actually said, I am going to create the world this way. Which is it?
So which way is the decree considered?
Yeah. So okay. So like I
So
s-
we do say that. I'm sorry. Well, I'm sorry. Let me just interject. Well, one or two points of clarification.
Sure.
So when I say that uh, before the decree, I do think that the decree of providence is eternal, and therefore it doesn't occur in a point of time. Creation is the start of time, but God's decree to create is also eternal. So it's not that God molds things over and then decided something in a temporal process.
Yeah.
So I that might get so when you say let there be light, that's not the time of the decree. That's the actual time of the creation, which is based on the decree, logically based on the decree, but it's not. That's not the. It's not as though there's a time when God didn't have his decree and then later on he had his decree. So I just want to make that clarification. But so when I say that when God knows what will happen, that is based on logically based on the decree. And if it's a question of what would happen, that might be contingent on some aspect of the decree to create. But it would be so what would happen in the real world is dependent on the decree to create the real world. It's logically contingent on that, as distinct from what would happen in a hypothetical world. But again, what would happen in a hypothetical world would still be contingent on God's decree to create that hypothetical world.
So let me. Okay. Um, but would you? Okay. So, but then would you make a distinction between Pharaoh, like what Pharaoh would, like that Pharaoh was stubborn and would refuse a polite offer? That's part of God's free knowledge, right?
Yes,
But the glass breaking, um,
the same thing.
is part of his free knowledge or middle
Yeah,
or
it's
his.
in the same way. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I think that's gonna. I think that's a mess. I'll just say, I can't imagine that's true. It seems. Let me see if I can draw out what the problem is. The the fundamental problem I have with that is that the glass can't be uh, part of God's free knowledge in that sense. It seems like it's something that's possible. The glass can break, and therefore it should just be part of God's natural knowledge. God has the ability to make glass in a circumstance with normal physics, and he knows the properties of that glass, which includes breakability. And that just has to be something that's possible, and he has to know it as part of his natural knowledge. And if we try to move it into his free knowledge, we're going to get into trouble. Now, the actual glasses out there, like I could walk over into my kitchen and grab a glass. The fact that that glass is there was part of God's free knowledge because God decided to create this world. Got it. But the concept of the glass and the fact that the glass in general is breakable, and that the world could have been different and a different glass could still be breakable. That has to be part of God's um, just something that God was able to do, and therefore it's part of God's natural knowledge. And to deny that it's part of His natural knowledge is to deny that God could do it. And so I think that's the problem. Ultimately it ends up denying God's omnipotence.
Were you asking whether God could have made glass unbreakable, or are you asking a different question?
No, so you just denied that the breakability of glass is part of God's natural knowledge. You said it was God's free knowledge.
Right, because God could have made glass differently.
Yeah, that also was part of God's natural knowledge. Both of those have to be part of God's natural knowledge. But
No, no,
then,
hold on a second. So the fact that glass is breakable, that's the way it actually is because God decided it would be that way. Therefore, it's part of his free knowledge.
right, but let's say God didn't create any glass. He still could create it breakable, right?
Well, if God, which is a different question,
It is. Go ahead.
but that's why it's very important. That's why it's very critical to distinguish between glass is breakable or glass could be breakable.
Yeah, okay, so let me put it this way. Everything that's part of God's free knowledge was originally part of God's natural knowledge, right?
I, well, I mean, the short answer to that is obviously not, because there's the sense the reason why it's not is because if you say that it is, then it reduces all of God's ability down to instantiating only the world that he actually instantiates, right? Otherwise, if that's because there's a distinction between what is and what could be. What could be is vast, and what is one.
Right.
So if God, unless God doesn't have a choice, then what could be is much vaster. And what makes the difference between which one of these could be's is God's choice in the matter. But God, unless God has no choice, in which case then it's already part of his natural knowledge what he chooses. But the the whole idea of distinguishing them analytically is to say that God has a choice in the matter of what exists, and therefore what is depends on God's choice, whereas what could be doesn't depend on God's choice. At least,
So I think that's right, but it's the reason why I would say that everything that's got part of God's free knowledge was first part of God's natural knowledge. Everything that is had to be possible before it became actual, right?
uh, everything, well, with the exception of the very fact that it is existent, right? That its very existence depends on God's decree. So
Yeah.
aside from that,
Yeah,
the thing
yeah.
that makes it real, yeah.
Yeah, the things that makes it actual, not just possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, agreed. So, but then I think you should agree with me that everything that is part of God's free knowledge, including the glass, like the actual glasses in my cabinet, right? Including them, they were part of God's natural knowledge logically prior to being part of God's free knowledge, right?
I think I think the issue I'm having is just with the wording. So
Okay.
yeah,
Uh, let's see.
but I think that the general idea. Uh, let's just say I don't object and move on with it from there, because
well, so
I don't
but
want to make an unnecessary objection to something. Maybe we are in
yeah,
agreement on that. Yeah.
no, but so we okay. So but let me. So the actual no kidding Pharaoh is part of God's free knowledge, but the the hypothetical of if Pharaoh were offered a or asked nicely, he would say no. That I if I understand you correctly, you're saying that is also part of God's free knowledge.
Because it's contingent on the created world.
Okay, so now you and I have a distinction here. And I think it is. I think this is a point of disconcurrence, because for me, free knowledge is what will happen, and that's not something that will happen. Therefore, it's not part of God's free knowledge. But you make it part of God's free knowledge because you think it's a result of God's decree, right?
The truth about what makes it a truthful statement depends on God's decree to create. Yes.
Right. Okay. And under your view, God was free. You know, he could have done it otherwise. He could have made Pharaoh such that he would say yes if asked nicely, but and he could have made Pharaoh so that he said no if he was asked nicely. And
Or you could have put a different Pharaoh on the throne.
yeah,
Yeah.
right, right. Okay. So fair enough. All right. So let's So here I wanted to bring in a passage from Irenaeus. I thought was really interesting. Um, so I wonder if it could be called Irenaeanism rather than Molinism. So this is Irenaeus, Against Heresies, Book 4, Chapter 29, and the second paragraph. The overall heading, which I know the heading, I think the headings are inserted by editors and stuff, right? The refutation arguments of the Marconites who attempted to show that God was the author of sin because he blinded Pharaoh and his servants. Um, okay, you with me?
1 second.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So in this second paragraph, what he says is, if therefore, in the present time also, God, knowing the number of those who will not believe, since he foreknows all things, has given them over to unbelief, and turned away his face from men of this stamp, leaving them in the darkness which they themselves chose for themselves. What is this? What is there wonderful if he did also at this time give them over to their unbelief? Pharaoh, who never would have believed, along with those who were with him, as the word spoke to Moses from the bush, I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless by a mighty hand. Exodus 3:19. And for the reason the Lord has spoken in parables, and brought blindness upon Israel, that seeing they might not see, since he knew the spirit of unbelief in them. For the same reason he did harden Pharaoh's heart, in order that, while seeing that it was the finger of God which led forth the people, he might not believe, but be precipitated into a sea of unbelief, resting in the notion that the exit of the Israelites was accomplished by a magical power, and that it was not by the operation of God that the Red Sea afforded passage to the people, but that this occurred merely by natural causes. Okay, so specifically, he's talking about Exodus 3:19, and he's basically saying that God knew that Pharaoh wouldn't believe. Um, so this, and he says things like, they chose this, um, they themselves chose this for themselves, right? And so this really, to me, does look like that Irenaeus analyzed this passage in a step towards middle knowledge, that God knew what Pharaoh would freely choose for himself, and that included unbelief, and that's part of the reason why he ended up being hardened. So I guess I would cite him as like some type of early type of Molinist. What do you think?
I do like the idea of proto-Molinists or something like that. Just in general, I like the idea of, introducing these concepts. The danger, of course, with many things like this is trying to, obviously trying to read a theologian in a, with respect to a controversy that he's not addressing, and which wasn't necessarily at all on his mind uh, when he was writing. Let me make sure that I have. Let me see. Make sure that I have the passage that I'm. I know you put it on the screen, but I just wanted to check a
Oh,
little bit from the surroundings.
okay.
Uh,
Irenaeus Against Heresies, Book 4, Chapter 29, second paragraph.
chosen. 429. Huh. It's interesting that this chosen for themselves is a phrase that he uses also earlier in the work. I just happened to find it because I was using that as the search phrase to find this part, but also Against Heresy, also book 4, chapter 6 has a similar expression. But let me just see. So I'm going to need more context. Chapter 29 is in the middle of something. Let me jump back to. Uh, let's see.
He's obviously addressing Marconites.
Same. Yes. So he's in the previous chapter. I guess he's bringing up this issue of uh, it looks as though uh, let's see. I'm sorry, it takes me a little bit to read through all of this. There's quite a lot of, in chapter 28, at section 3. So if you click on the 28 there and scroll down, maybe don't scroll down quite yet, but it seems as though his primary focus here is trying to focus on the fact that God is the same in both testaments. And in section 3 of this, he begins talking about smiting the Egyptians. And he says, these same facts, I say, shall nevertheless repeat themselves in the Lord, who judges for eternity those whom he does judge, and lets go free for eternity those whom he does let go free. And he shall thus be discovered, according to the language used by these men, as having been the cause of their most heinous sin to those who laid hands upon him and pierced him. For if he had not so come, it follows that these men could not have become the slaves of the Lord. And if he had not sent prophets to them, they certainly could not have killed them, nor the apostles either. To those, therefore, who assail us and say, if the Egyptian had not been afflicted by the plagues, and when pursuing after Israel had been choked in the sea, God could not have saved his people, this answer must be, or may be given, unless then the Jews had become the servants of the Lord, which did indeed take eternal life away from them, and by killing the apostles and persecuting the church had fallen into an abyss of wrath, we could not have been saved. So it's sort of like he's trying to flip it back on the if this is an objection to the Old Testament, then it's also an objection to the New Testament. For as they were saved by means of the blindness of the Egyptians, so we are too by that of the Jews, if indeed the death of the Lord is the condemnation of those who fastened him to the cross and who did not believe his advent, but the salvation of those who believe in him. The apostle does also say in the second epistle of Corinthians, whereas sorry, I'm trying to read faster than I can read out loud. And but who are they who are saved now and receive eternal life? Is it not those who love God and who believe his promises and who in malice have become as little children? And that's the immediate context before 29, where he then says, and I'm sorry, I don't have it set up to jump to the next chapter easily. It's 5. Wasn't it? It was 4. There we go. But they say God hardened the heart. Those then who allege such difficulties for the one and the same God that blesses others inflicts blindness upon those who do not believe, but who set him at naught, just as a son, which is a creature of his, acts like those, but in accordance to those who believe and follow him, he grants fuller illumination. If therefore in the present time also God, knowing the number of those who will not believe, since he foreknows all things, has given them over to unbelief and turned away his face from men of this stamp, leaving them in the darkness which they themselves have chosen for themselves, what is there wonderful if he did also at that time give over to their unbelief Pharaoh, who never would have believed, along with those who were with him. So what I would say, so in terms of, I think I now understand the full context of what he's saying. So in terms of the question of whether his, it's not quite a theodicy, but his apologetic here, his apologetic for the destruction of Pharaoh is that God knows everything in advance, and he knows that Pharaoh never would have believed, right? So in that limited sense, it's like Molinism in the sense that it's it's making God's decision contingent on foreknowing some future a future thing, something that a hypothetical future contingent. Right. It doesn't directly address whether the issue of the relation of that to God's decree to create, but there's a definite sympathy between that view and the view expressed in Molinism. So, uh, and the implication is that the entire world, before Jesus, is in that same category of they would never have believed, right? So that's why he says all those, right? Where is it? Uh, the number of those who will not believe. God knows the numbers of those who will not believe, since he foreknows all things, has given them over to unbelief and turned away his face from men of this stamp. So,
So, what's the apologetic value if this is something that God decided and is part of his free knowledge because he decreed it?
uh, what's the apologetic value?
Yeah.
Well, one aspect of the apologetic value would be to defend. I mean, the focus, of course, for Irenaeus in this apologetic is defending the idea that the God of the New Testament is the same as the God of the Old Testament. So
Okay.
whether you like God doing this or not, he's intentionally preventing people from seeing the light in the New Testament. So if your criticism is, well, the God of the Old Testament hardened Pharaoh's heart, you can't say that that negates the God of the Old Testament, because in the New Testament we have these parables. And then one solution that he offers is these are people who never would have believed anyway. Now he calls them men of this stamp, which seems to imply there's some unchangeable part of their character that's the reason for this. It's kind of they're innately unbelievers, in other words. But he doesn't directly address that issue of the relation, how in what's the basis upon which they never would have believed. And his opponent isn't concerned with that aspect. He's not the opponent isn't concerned with, as far as I can see, with people having some freedom from predetermination. He has a problem with the idea of God, the Old Testament God, being this mean God who does mean things to Pharaoh. But if God is so mean to Pharaoh, and the New Testament God is just as mean to the Jews of Jesus' time, that's Irenaeus' response. I think in a nutshell. But I would say, I would definitely put it this way: this kind of explanation is certainly more, at least to this point that we've talked about, and setting aside this men of this stamp, which is on the screen that you're showing. It's like halfway through that same line. That men of this stamp sounds a lot less like this is a view of human freedom, and more like this is these men are character in their fundamental character is flawed. That
So,
these are people who are just innately not going to believe. But
so
yeah, in otherwise it does, you can wedge it in a nice way to fit that idea, or you can wedge it in the way of saying this is a hypothetical consideration that God goes through, and then once he sees they're never going to believe, he ordains things differently.
So I think that just from a high level, that the providential control that God exhibits, that when you contrast a middle knowledge approach and to a deterministic approach, when you talk about determinism, you're talking about power and God exercising his power in the way he's created, and he's using his omnipotence to execute what he wants. Whereas in the um, middle knowledge or Molinistic style approach, you have more God's wisdom and his knowledge to guide things the way he wants. And I think that's just two different focuses. Now, I'm not saying that determinists say that God is doesn't have wisdom. Of course, he does in both views. And I'm not saying that God doesn't have power in Molinism. Of course, he does, right? But just the orientation is more focused on God's wisdom and his knowledge in a middle knowledge approach, and that those are kind of the tools that he's using to control things, versus on the deterministic approach where it's more of a hands-on, just causally determining things to be the way that they are. So that's part of the orientation that I see here in Irenaeus, right? Like, since he knows the number of those who will not believe, since he foreknows all things, themselves have chosen for themselves those who would never believe, right? That type of orientation, Irenaeus is using to explain this text and explain what happened with Pharaoh, and it's not so much about God's hand or control, power, decree, building Pharaoh that way. It's more God knowing Pharaoh is that way and then using that situation to work things out the way he wants to.
I I don't 100% disagree with your point, but I'm just again to underscore the fact that he's dealing with different. The reason why he doesn't get into that issue is because he's not dealing with that objection. He's dealing with an objection
Okay.
that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are different.
Right.
That's why he's focusing on an explanation, which, as I said, you can apply it to both the Molinistic position and to some extent to the Molinistic position and to some extent to the Calvinistic position. And it doesn't necessarily fall in neatly to either one,
Right.
but it definitely, I would say the idea that God knows the number of those who will not believe because he knows all things, yeah, that definitely sounds more on the Molinistic side of things, whereas the turn to face away from men of this stamp uh, sounds more like the Calvinism thing, and leaving them in the darkness, which they have themselves chosen for themselves, again, sounds more like the Calvinistic side. But there's ultimately, it's one of those challenges of trying to, like I said, trying to put it into
Sure.
another context.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So fair enough. All right. So I think we have maybe about 20 minutes left. What I'd suggest is we can just breeze through a couple of these passages and just noting, I think we're going to both have the same type of explanations, but there's different aspects maybe we can just highlight and touch on if that's okay.
Okay.
All right. So the next verse I had is a combination of two. So it's Deuteronomy 7, 3 through 4, in combination with 1 Kings 11, 2 and 1 Kings 11, 9. So Deuteronomy 7, 3 through 4 is a warning. It says, it's a command, you shall not intermarry them. So the Israelites aren't supposed to intermarry with the other nations, giving your daughters or sons to take their daughters in marriage. For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Right. And then later this actually happens in 1 Kings 11, 2. And it says, for the nations concerned, which the Lord had said unto the people, you shall not until marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your hearts from God. Solomon clung to these in love, and the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to them twice. So it's interesting here, because this is not counterfactual knowledge, but it is still, I would say it is still middle knowledge. And I don't know if you're going to agree with that, but I would say that normally it's easier to identify these things when it doesn't actually happen. But in this case, we have an issue. It actually happened, right? God gave him a warning that, if you intermarry, your hearts are going to turn away from God. And they intermarried and their hearts were turned away from God, right? But it doesn't take away the hypothetical aspect of this original statement. It was just that sometimes in these statements about what would happen, it happens, and sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't happen, it's counterfactual. When it happens, it's factual. But either way, it's the same idea. God knows what would happen under various circumstances. So I thought that part was interesting, just to make the point that not everything that is part of God's middle knowledge is counterfactual. It could be factual. Does that make sense?
I think the I want to reiterate that Calvinists believe that God knows what would happen. I would also point out that you can still make true state even if you had a godless determinism, you could still where there's no God in the picture, everything's just biologically or mechanically determined. You can still make true hypothetical, assuming there was some truth maker in general, which you wouldn't in a truly godless situation, but assuming there's some truth maker for a deterministic world, purely deterministic world, you could still have true statements about hypothetical situations, and those true statements would be things like, if you drink 2 spoonfuls of ipecac, you'll vomit. And that's true whether you actually drink the ipecac or you don't drink the ipecac. What grounds it is the nature of the world in which we live. So in the world in which we live, if you swallow a lot of ipecac, you vomit. And that doesn't matter that it's a human being with human creaturely will, or it wouldn't matter if you're saying a very similar thing about if you took 2 spoonfuls of vinegar. If 2 spoonfuls of vinegar are added to 2 spoonfuls of baking soda, there's an eruption. That takes out the human element from it, but it's just the same grounding is the case. I mean, most of the vinegar just sits there on the shelf. Most of the baking soda sits on the shelf, and rarely do the two meet. But if they did, this would be the result. The truth of that statement has nothing to do with a middle knowledge. It has to do with the free knowledge of God, because it has to do with the nature of the things. It doesn't have, and the nature of the things comes from God.
We're stuck again.
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously, I think for the same reasons I already said, and so I won't repeat them. I think that's part of God's natural knowledge. It has to be. I can't. Yeah. So
Okay.
I'll leave it at that. Okay. Next verse. This one's the famous one, right? There's two famous ones, right?
Sorry. And to point out that the same principle is evil communication corrupts good manners in the Proverbs is a similar statement to the thing about if you chase foreign wives, they'll lead you astray. It's a kind of a general statement, not an absolute statement, but the truth of it is in the nature of the effect that these things have. And it's true because there's a cause and effect, but that's why it depends on the way God made things.
So okay, so let me ask that question just to suss it out a little. So glass has a property such that, if it's struck by a rock, it'll break, given the normal laws of physics, right?
Yeah.
So that's a cause and effect relationship. It's like a physical force. It's I guess you'd call it a contact force.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, that type of relationship, do people's choice have that type of cause and effect relationship with whatever causes people to, in your view, in a deterministic view, is it a cause and effect relationship like a rock and a glass?
There is a cause and effect relationship between taking foreign wives and following after false gods. Is it exactly like a rock and a glass? No, it's not. But it's a lot like a sheep, which is why the scriptures use that as an analogy for human misbehavior.
So, how is it different? Let's say the appearance of the foreign wives, so the foreign wives are a physical thing, and the person that's led astray by the foreign wives is a physical thing. And there's a mental image in the person's brain of the foreign wives and all the things that they've done. And there's a nature within his brain. So if he's a mechanism, right, even though we don't see it as clearly as we do a rock and glass, is it not behaving that way? Is it not a contact inside the person's brain between his sensory input from the foreign wives and the way his brain physically is.
They're the only or the big uh, qualification to that is that human beings are more than just a brain. We also have a spirit. And
Okay.
there is some interaction between the brain and the spirit that is mysterious, that we don't understand. So that's one way in which this human beings are different from pottery, is that we have a spirit, right? We're not just we're not literally just pots. That's an analogy, but it's not the full picture. So yes, a pot. If you put a pot in certain conditions, you can break the pot. And there's some analogy between human beings and pots, but it's not a complete analogy. A better analogy is something like a sheep, where the sheep is, it has its own animating force. And so some of the causes for what cause a sheep to do what it does are these internal causes, not only the external causes.
So that when you use terms like force and causation with respect to an immaterial soul, like in a Cartesian dualist sense, um, you're not using them in the same way that you would use it in a physics textbook. Like that's not the type of force you're talking about. That's not the type of causation you're talking about, right? It's something slightly different.
Uh, I'm leaving aside the question of Cartesian dualism or something like that. The my point is that the animating aspects of a human being are more complex and different from the merely acted upon physical objects that are underneath that reality. So there's more to human beings than just the atoms colliding with each other. That's there's an animating force that goes with humans, and there are internal causes in humans that's different from the kind of the essentially external forces with respect to atoms bouncing around. So I do view those as analogous, perhaps, but certainly different from one another. The similarity might be, you could think of someone being uh, sometimes they're described as stiff-necked people. These people are stiff-necked. The idea being that there's something almost the way that a physical object can be stiff. There's something in their character that's stiff, that won't bend, that won't submit. So there's some analogy, but I would say, I think it over reduces things to say it's just the same as two mechanical objects.
Okay, so, but it still seems to me that there's a very good chance that we're equivocating on the word causation and force. Like what I think when I'm thinking of causation and force is not what you think when you're thinking causation and force. Because it doesn't seem to me that force is the right word to use on a spirit, on a soul.
Okay.
Okay, but let me see if I can suss this out. It's um, you still say it's a necessary. Well, actually, let me ask it this way. So we have a soul, and that soul is like the source of our will and intelligence or whatever. And something, some X, acts on that soul, and given the action of X, the soul's action is necessary and can't be otherwise. Would you agree with that?
I think that only makes sense if there's a lot of qualifications and caveats put on it, right?
Okay.
So if you're saying, if you're saying that, uh, but if you're saying that you're including all of the person in your equation of like assuming the person is exactly as they are in all characteristics, then it couldn't be otherwise. That is exactly how the person will act. Then yes. Now, if you're saying if the person were more compassionate, they would do something else, or if the person were more wise, they would do something else, or if the person would keep themselves from the foreign wives, then there would be some different thing. Okay, but if you put in the caveats that everything is as it is, and this situation happens, then it naturally what naturally will come, and it
Oh,
can't be otherwise. Otherwise, it doesn't naturally flow from.
okay, in the X, trying to define the X, sometimes Calvinists will say it's the strongest desire. Other times they'll say it's the motive. Are those what you would plug in for your X in this equation? Or would you say it some other way?
I mean, John, I think it was, I want to say it was Jonathan Edwards or somebody like that who said used the idea of strongest desire. Uh, I mean, human beings aren't exactly an adding machine that, mathematically figure out what's their strongest desire and then act on it. But it's not a bad way of looking at things. And, there are factors that cause one desire to be stronger than another. And that's one of the reasons why this type of warning is meaningful. If it weren't the case that there's causes for people's actions, then these kind of warnings wouldn't be either necessary or meaningful. In other words, if it doesn't have an effect to have the foreign wives, then it's an odd warning. Like why would the warning be any more significant that you not have foreign wives than you not color your clothes blue? If it has no effect, like presumably we can both agree that wearing blue clothes doesn't have the same kind of effect as being intermarried with a pagan idolatrous woman. And it's sort of intuitive that that's the case. I mean, it seems obvious the force, not in a obviously not mechanical force, but the force that being around someone who's constantly worshiping her false idols can have on a person. Not only just because of Solomon's example, but it just kind of intuitively makes sense that that's the way human beings are. If you're around someone who does certain things, you're going to be drawn into those things.
Yeah, so I think there's a question there as to what that relationship is. Is it something that causally determines the action, or is it something that makes it more likely? It's persuasive and tempting and that sort of thing. So I guess if that's the case, let's say it's the strongest desire is the X, and the X necessitates the action such that it can't be otherwise. It really, really does look like the breaking of the glass. It's just the contact and the force is against someone's immaterial soul rather than against their material glass, against the material of the glass. But the basic relationship is analogous in both cases. It's a cause and effect relationship.
It doesn't seem like there's any escape from that by saying that something influences or does something else just to escape the idea of causal determinism. I mean, either there are causes and effects or they're not causes and effects. And if it doesn't in fact cause the result, it's a strange warning. And if it does in fact cause the result, it kind of makes sense. And our intuition is that it does cause that result. And then to say, well, it doesn't cause it infallibly, it just makes it more likely. It's hard to understand how even something like more likely or more probable makes any sense outside of a deterministic context.
So unless the probability is 100%, it doesn't make sense for a probability to be less than 100%.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the idea of something controlling the probability is only consistent with a deterministic way of looking at things.
Hmm. Why? Like, okay, so let's say this is like a random number generator that, is going to um, generate a number between 1 and 100, and um, the probability is like equally distributed between 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 100,
Hmm.
right?
That only makes
Versus
sense in a deterministic world. Something provides it with that uniformity of the distribution.
the fact that those are all the alternatives. right? Like, okay, so like if it was 1 to 2, it'd be 50-50. If it was 1 to 100, it's, 1 out of 100.
So just the one of the traditional examples of uniform distribution is the 1 out of 2, the coin toss, right?
Right.
That's one of the traditional illustrations. But in the case of a coin toss, what causes the distribution to be 50-50 is that it's a fairer coin. If the coin is weighted to one side or the other, such that more than 50% shows up heads, or then that's considered not a fair coin. But that's because it's a deterministic. The coin's head or tail is deterministic, and in order for it to be a fair coin, where it comes out 50% one way and 50% the other way, the weighting has to be balanced, and as well, the launching mechanism has to be balanced as well. I mean, otherwise, it's pretty trivial if you just lean the coin over and release it and hope it doesn't overbalance, right? That's just silly. No one accepts a coin toss where the person intentionally places it heads up on the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason why people like to appeal to coin tosses and other lots, as an example, for which God does take the credit that it's all in his hands. But the reason why people cast lots or flip coins is because the idea is to take it out of, even though we know it's a deterministic uh, thing, we're trying to take that determination out of our own hands.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I could agree that, let's say that the coin flip thing is deterministic, but um, it's unknown what that and unknowable. What, I guess at least as far as we have resources right now, we can't figure that out, right? So it's not something that we can determine what the result of the coin toss is going to be, even if mechanically it is determined. I guess that would be the way to say it. So at least as far as we know, um, it's indeterministic because we can't determine the result. It's epistemically deterministic, even if it's causally deterministic.
We don't know we are ignorant of the outcome
Yeah.
because we're unable to determine the outcome. But that
Right.
doesn't change the fact that the idea of let's say even with a loaded die, let's say that you take a die and you load a little extra weight that's off center, so that what happens there is on any given roll, you and I still don't know which number is going to show up on that die. Although we will know if we rolled it 100 times that one of those numbers is going to come up a lot more than the others. And that is the result of the determining mechanism of weighting in the die. So that's the reason why it would be considered a loaded die, because the weights are off balance and the results are skewed as a result compared to a uniform distribution. But all of that assumes both the fact that it should be a uniform distribution and the fact that unloaded dice or loaded dice, it isn't a uniform distribution, requires the understanding of the world as deterministic, even though our knowledge of the outcome, our advanced knowledge of the outcome, is zero. We just don't know. Unless we're using loaded dice, then we have a better idea, a better
So
guess.
I'm gonna ask you a fair question for right at the end of the episode. So do you believe in quantum indeterminism? Like,
I believe in it? I
yeah.
I don't. I'm not sure I understand quantum indeterminism well enough to have a belief in or against it. So
Okay.
the idea, there are a lot of advanced physics concepts that are counterintuitive or hard to fully understand. Certain things like quantum entanglement, for example, I I don't know for sure why that should work. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me intuitively. Supposedly it does work, and maybe in fact it really does work. But you know, ultimately, uh, there is in fact a reason for why everything is the way it is. And there's reasons for things like the warnings, and the one you just put on the screen, and I kind of interrupted you as you were about to talk to it, talk about it, which is a another hypothetical situation, and in fact, David didn't stay to be surrendered by the men of was it Keilah? They there is a reason for the things that do happen, and there's a reason why the things that don't happen but would have happened. There's a reason behind it, and it's not simply uh, God watching a future dice roll, a hypothetical dice roll, and then figuring it out. God is in control of the dice. So even if it's a matter of, if you had rolled the dice a few seconds later, what would the outcome have been? God knows the answer to that, and He knows that answer based on the nature of dice. He without any appeal to human agency as such. So I don't yeah I not I wonder if there's a disconnect in the idea that people think that Calvinism is the idea kind of God's individually zapping outcomes into the world without any regard to any cause and effect chain, when in fact Calvinism is exactly the opposite, affirming that God uses cause and effect.
I'm not sure that Calvinism is monolithic on some of the things he said. I don't. I've met Calvinists who are not determinists, and I've also met Calvinists that are more Thomistic rather than Edwardsian in their determinism. So I guess, do you agree on, at least on that much, that there's some variation within Calvinism and you're taking more of a Edwards type position?
I would say that of course there's room for various positions within Calvinism for sure. So there are some room. There was a guy, uh, I think his name was Tyson, who was going around a few years ago promoting something that he called Reformed Molinism, which I I cannot recall for the life of me whether it really was Molinism or if it was just an affirmation of the fact that God knows hypothetical contingents. But in any event, there are a lot of people, and of course, Calvinism doesn't have your internet searches are all on the screen, by the way.
Yeah.
The
Is this the guy you were thinking of, Oliver Crisp, Deviant Calvinism?
No, it's I think it's Terry Tyson.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah. Okay, I know what you're talking about.
I
Anyways,
think that's his name, and
yeah,
let me see if I
yeah. I know
he
who you're
had
talking about.
he had posted something in, I think it was in one of the Westminster journals or something like that. But in any event, I think I had seen it quite a long time ago, but I don't recall offhand where the article is, and I hate representing things that I haven't read in a decade based on that. But anyway, the point is, there is no Pope of Calvinism that gets to decide what everybody who's a Calvinist believes, and if you don't hold to those views, you're not really a Calvinist. There is, there's a Turretin view of middle knowledge, which I think I've been fairly accurate in representing Turretin's view on this particular topic, not on every single thing Turretin believed, but that Turretin's views are uh, then again there may be some details or nuances that Turretin doesn't get into, and then Edwards goes beyond Turretin in some points, and which isn't surprising if given their relative times, but it's not and certainly not every detail of Edwards is accepted by all Calvinists either. And as far as what constitutes determinism or not, I I think it's a little bit strange to say that you're a Calvinist if you don't believe that that you that God hasn't determined every single thing that ever will happen. And you couldn't really call yourself a Molinist and say that God hasn't determined it in some sense, everything that happened, at least in the sense of decreeing the instantiation of that.
So, in terms of Calvinistic determinist, I see, in my mind, at least break them into two categories, where Edwards is what I would call a causal determinist Calvinist. And specifically, what he's going to say are things like that the motive determines the will, or the greatest desire determines the will. And it's what I would say the way that's related is that there's this God is the primary cause of all things, but the secondary causes themselves do determine the will. Whereas a Thomistic type determinist, theistic determinist, um, would say that the secondary causes do not determine the will. So nothing in nature, like the motive or the greatest desire, determines the will. Rather, it's God directly determining the will through his concurrence with the will itself. So it's, one is like the secondary causes determine the will, the other is the secondary causes don't determine the will, rather, it's God's concurrence with the will's existence itself that determines the will. So it's more of a direct action on the will. Not that it's like all that different, but one is more of a causal determinism, and it looks a little more naturalistic, and the other is looks a more spiritual because it's God's direct hand. Okay. Anyways, oh well. So we should probably start wrapping this up. So let me say this, just from a sheer like programming type perspective. I'd like to come back to this subject, but I'd like to deal with what I think are more fundamental things first. I said that from the get go. It comes down to me that you have to have God's providence and man's free will and responsibility and God's foreknowledge of the future kind of firmly in view before you get to middle knowledge. So in some sense, I feel like, this is a good episode, and it keeps coming up, so I get exactly why we're doing this. But I think, to me, there's more fundamental issues to address first, at least from my standpoint. What do you think?
I think that it's very helpful if we're able to start from a shared understanding of that. It's actually very helpful if we have a shared terminology and a shared uh, understanding of what we're describing. And I'm not sure we got there today. It seemed like we were, even towards the end of the discussion, we're not 100% in agreement about which things are free and which are natural knowledge, and that makes a conversation very challenging. Whether we should, whether the solution to that is to step back and go to even more fundamental topics, I'm not sure. Maybe. Oh, by the way, the book. If you're looking for a book that might that has, I guess, Mr. Tyson's view. And I will add the caveat that I double checked because I had something by him on my blog quite a long time ago. And it was some link to his post suggesting that William Lane Craig is not a Molinist, which, is an interesting point of view. And I think he has subsequently, at some point, acknowledged that he himself is not a 5-point Calvinist. But he has Calvinism and Middle Knowledge, a conversation, which he contributed part of. And I don't know who else is contributors. I suppose some of I haven't read the book. I'll give you that qualification. I recall some time ago he was advocating that you can be a Molinist and also a Calvinist. Whether he still holds that, I don't know. I haven't read his book, but it might suggest that there are some other Calvinist views. Paul Helm is someone who I usually think of as a Calvinist. So I don't know what Paul Helm wrote in the book. Maybe it's just something to people to read if they have another, what is that, 36 bucks? I don't know. I haven't read it. So if if I were to read it, I might have more insight on that point. But yes, that's a very long answer to the monolithic question. Also, in terms of having a shared vocabulary, it'd be very helpful. It might also be helpful in some sense. I mean, there's always a risk when we don't have a shared vocabulary that we're vehemently agreeing about something. In other words, if you're saying, well, God knows X, and you're calling that, free knowledge or middle knowledge or whatever it is, and I say he also knows X, but I call it a different thing, if that's all the difference is, that you call it something, whereas I call it something else, then we're just, that's a trivial disagreement. It might still be useful to have that argument, but it's trivial if it's just a matter of labels. And if it's a matter of we're disagreeing about a more fundamental point, it would be nice to have at least some point at which we could use shared labels to underscore the difference. Uh, Even if that means we have to abandon terms like middle or free or natural. Uh, but uh, some once you have that shared vocabulary, it's easier to reveal the underlying differences on the point. I'm concerned whether that same issue, like let's say we went into a deeper or more fundamental disagreement than middle knowledge. Uh, I wonder if we would end up essentially having that same problem just magnified. Uh,
Yeah, at least we could get to something that's underlined. But yeah, there's a good chance we're going to have disconcurrances on more fundamental issues. In fact, almost certainly. But it's once you once you get to like the top level, like once you get to the bottom layer of the pyramid, if you've got differences there, it's going to be far more pronounced, more fundamental. Yeah, absolutely. There has to be. It's got to be in the whole determinism libertarian debate. I think is more fundamental than middle knowledge itself. Um,
the libertarian free will debate.
the libertarian free will versus deterministic, yeah, determinism versus libertarianism, compatibilism versus libertarian free will. Those issues are more foundational. If you're not a libertarian, you're not going to be a monist. You can't. I mean, it's not gonna happen.
I don't
I
know. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know, but I would say
yeah,
it certainly a lot will depend then on definitions, right? So if
yeah,
some people present Molinism as just if God knows hypothetically what's going to happen, if you believe God knows what would hypothetically happen, you're a Molinist. Well, then almost any Calvinist is a Molinist because more or less any Calvinist believes that. But then you've defined Molinism in that case in a way that's not very. It doesn't create any distinction where maybe a distinction is useful or necessary. But if the same kind of problem can happen if we debated free will. We just said, well, the issue here is libertarianism just means that you believe man has a will. And then we both just shake hands and walk away, both libertarians. Or a determinist says that that men,
yeah.
you could pick something, but something where we could both agree to it. Um, you know, it's it's great, and it's good that we have a lot of unity on a lot of things. It's not bad. I mean, that's part of the reason that we can have this discussion in the first place is there's so much unity on so many things. Uh, anyway, I think I'm just concerned that the same. I think you and I had a debate quite a while ago on free will, and there was uh, some part of that debate which revolved around picking definitions or
Yeah.
defending definitions, and that, at least from my standpoint, is kind of a point where I wish we could get past that need to uh, I don't know, trying to get past the definition to the thing behind the definition is sort of in my mind more important, and yet you can't really do it until you have at least some words you agree on. And it's a little bit, the analogy breaks down, but it's a little bit like when you're trying to talk with, let's say, Mormons about God and angels and humans, and you might feel like you're having a lot of agreement along the way, but then you start trying to explain what you believe, and some things you say are just not going to make sense if they're not familiar with non-Mormon views. And vice versa, if you're not familiar with Mormon views, some of the things that they may be saying will sound really, really weird, like the idea that maybe Noah or somebody like that is now an angel. That will sound really weird. Like those are totally different beings. They have, they're two different kinds of beings. They're not just different stages of the same human being. And there's lots of things like that uh, that are that make those type of dialogues more difficult. And I don't know if our dialogue, I don't think our dialogue exactly suffers from that same problem, obviously, but there's something there of that. So anyway, I know I've kind of gone on a long time. I
No,
apologize.
no, it's all good stuff. I agree. So I would like to get into the determinism versus free will discussion. I think it has to take place before you can get into Molinism because, like I said, I can't imagine. I mean, that's the way I started out. I started out with, I have two fundamental commitments first that are more important to me than Molinism, which is God's providence covers everything, and people have libertarian free will, right? That's more foundational to me than middle knowledge. But you can't build middle knowledge without having those two things. And you don't have those two things, right? You have one of them. You don't have the other, right? So obviously you're not going to follow through with the rest of it.
Well, the way you worded it now, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The way you worded it before at the beginning, I do have those. I do think that men have wills and they make choices and they're responsible for their choices.
Yeah.
That was the way you had worded it at the beginning of the talk. But the way you worded it now, where you specify now a specific kind of freedom, then yeah, I don't agree with that. And that, in the sense, that is more fundamental.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. All right. Good stuff. Well, it was, as always, it's a great pleasure chatting with you.
likewise,
All right.
always a pleasure.
I'll be with you.
And with you.